fluorescent lights in courtroom 3B made everyone look like they were dying, which seemed fitting given why we were all there. I sat 3 rows behind the plaintiff's table, watching my daughter-in-law Rebecca smooth her black pencil skirt for the 100th time. She did that when she was nervous, a tell I'd picked up during the 18 months I'd known her. 18 months. That's all the time I'd had with my son Marcus before the accident took him away. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, shuffled through papers while the lawyers whispered among themselves. I caught fragments: contested will, undue influence, mental capacity. Words that reduced my brother Harold's 73 years to legal terminology. Rebecca's attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my client has been devastated by the loss of her husband. She's barely had time to grieve before discovering that Mr. Harold Brennan's will leaves virtually everything to someone who—" He paused dramatically, turning to gesture at me. "Someone who wasn't even part of the family." The words hit like a slap, but I'd been expecting them. Rebecca had made her feelings clear at Marcus's funeral 6 months ago. I was the uncle who'd shown up out of nowhere, the one who'd somehow wormed his way into Harold's good graces during his final years. In her version of the story, I was a vulture circling a lonely old man. I shifted in my seat, the vinyl squeaking beneath me. My lawyer, Patricia Chen, caught my eye and gave me a slight nod. "We'd been over this. Stay calm. Let them make their case. The truth would come out." But sitting there, listening to Rebecca's attorney paint me as a manipulative stranger, I wondered if the truth was enough. After all, until 5 years ago, I really hadn't been part of this family. I'd been living my own life in Portland, working construction, minding my own business. I'd barely spoken to Harold in decades. The accident changed everything. Not Marcus's accident. Mine. 5 years earlier, I was 42 and stupid enough to think I was invincible. The scaffold collapse at the Morrison Avenue project put an end to that delusion, along with my career and most of my left leg's functionality. Workers' comp covered the immediate medical bills, but they don't pay you to lie in a hospital bed feeling sorry for yourself. That's free. The physical therapy, the job retraining programs, the endless paperwork, battles with insurance companies. None of that prepared me for the phone call that came 3 weeks after my discharge. "Danny, this is Harold Brennan, your brother." I almost hung up. Harold and I hadn't spoken since our father's funeral 8 years earlier, and even then, it had been perfunctory handshakes and mumbled condolences. He was the successful one, the one who'd gone to college, become a lawyer, married well, had kids. I was the screw-up who'd dropped out of high school and spent most of my 20s working dead-end jobs and drinking too much. "I heard about your accident," he said. "I wanted to check on you." "I'm fine." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie you tell to maintain whatever dignity you have left. "Are you? Because from what I understand, you're not working, and you're behind on rent." I wanted to ask how he knew that, but I was afraid of the answer. Harold had always been thorough. If he was calling, he'd already done his homework. "What do you want?" "Harold, I want to help. I have a proposition for you." The proposition was simple. Come to Salem, live in the guest house behind his property, help him with some projects around the house. In exchange, he'd cover my living expenses and give me time to figure out what came next. "I don't need charity," I told him. "It's not charity. I'm 68 years old, Danny. My wife died 3 years ago, and my kids live across the country. I could use the company, and you could use a fresh start." I should have been suspicious. Should have wondered why Harold suddenly wanted his black sheep brother around. But I was broke, in pain, and tired of sleeping on my friend's couch. Sometimes desperation makes decisions for you. 2 weeks later, I was driving a U-Haul across Oregon, my entire life reduced to what could fit in the back of a 10-foot truck. Harold's property was nothing like I'd expected. The main house was a modest ranch-style home from the 1970s, well-maintained, but not ostentatious. The guest house was even simpler, basically a studio apartment with a small kitchen and bathroom. It was clean, functional, and completely devoid of personality. "It's not much," Harold said as he showed me around. but it's private. You can come and go as you please. He'd aged since I'd last seen him. His hair had gone completely gray and he'd lost weight. But his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, missing nothing. Those were the eyes that had gotten him through law school, that had built his practice, that had always made me feel like he was taking my measure and finding me wanting. "So what exactly are these projects you mentioned?" I asked. Harold smiled. "Nothing too strenuous. I want to digitize some old family documents, organize my files, maybe do some landscaping. Think of it as light clerical work with occasional manual labor." It sounded easy enough. Too easy, actually, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. The first few weeks were awkward. Harold would knock on my door around 9 in the morning, we'd have coffee in his kitchen, and he'd give me tasks for the day. Scan documents, sort through boxes of old photographs, help him move furniture. Simple stuff that didn't require much conversation. But Harold was a talker. He'd tell me stories about his cases, about his late wife, Margaret, about his children. Sarah lived in Denver with her family, working as a pediatrician. Thomas was in Seattle, running his own accounting firm. They called regularly, he said, but visits were rare. "They have their own lives," he'd say, and I could hear the loneliness in his voice. I started staying for dinner, not every night, but often enough that it became routine. Harold was a decent cook, and it beat eating frozen dinners alone in the guest house. We'd talk about current events, old movies, anything except the obvious question, why was I really there? The answer came on a rainy Thursday in November when Harold collapsed while we were going, through boxes in his basement. The paramedic said it was a minor heart attack, what Harold's cardiologist later called a warning shot. 2 days in the hospital, a new medication regimen, and strict orders to avoid stress and heavy lifting. "You probably saved my life," Harold told me during the drive home. "If you hadn't been there..." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I'd found him unconscious on the basement floor, called 911, and stayed with him until the ambulance arrived. It was what anyone would have done. "Is that why you asked me to come here?" I asked. "Because you were worried about your health?" Harold stared out the passenger window. "Partly, but there's more to it than that." He waited until we were back at the house, until he was settled in his recliner with a cup of tea, before he told me the rest. "I've been having some problems with my memory," he said. "Little things at first, forgetting where I put my keys, struggling to remember names. My doctor says it might be the early stages of dementia." The words hung in the air between us. Harold Brennan, the man whose mind had always been his greatest asset, was losing it piece by piece. "The kids don't know," he continued. "I haven't told them because I don't want them to worry, and I don't want them to start making decisions for me before I'm ready. But you told me. You're here. You see me every day. You would have figured it out eventually anyway." He leaned forward in his chair. "I need someone I can trust, Danny. Someone who doesn't have an agenda." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Harold, I'm living in your guest house rent-free. I'm eating your food, you're paying my bills. How is that not having an agenda?" "Because you could leave tomorrow if you wanted to. You don't need anything from me except what I'm already giving you. My children, they love me, but they also stand to inherit everything I've built. That creates complications." It was a cynical view of family loyalty, but I couldn't argue with the logic. Harold was worth millions, his law practice, his investments, his property. That kind of money had a way of changing people's priorities. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Help me figure out what I want to do with all of this," he said, gesturing around the room. "And help me do it while I'm still capable of making my own decisions." That conversation changed everything. Over the next few months, I became Harold's confidant, his memory, aide, and eventually, his closest friend. We'd spend hours going through his papers, talking about his wishes, discussing his concerns about the future. It was during one of these conversations that he first mentioned changing his will. "I've been thinking about Marcus," Harold said one evening in March. We were in his study, surrounded by legal documents and family photographs. "Sarah's oldest boy. He'll be graduating high school soon. I knew about Marcus from the photos scattered around. Harold's house. a lanky kid with Harold's eyes and his mother's smile. Soccer player, honor roll student, the kind of grandson who made holiday visits feel like events. Sarah wants him to go to Stanford, Harold continued. Pre-med track, following in Mom's footsteps. That's expensive, very, and Sarah and her husband are already stretched thin with the mortgage and the other kids. Harold picked up a photo of Marcus from his desk. I've been thinking about setting up an education fund. Something substantial enough to cover not just undergraduate but medical school too. It seemed like a generous gesture, the kind of thing a wealthy grandfather should do. But knowing Harold, there was more to it. There's a catch, isn't there? Harold smiled. Not a catch exactly. But I want to make sure the money is used responsibly. I've seen too many cases where young people get access to large sums and make poor choices. He wanted to establish a trust fund with specific conditions. Marcus would get access to the money only for educational expenses and only if he maintained good grades and stayed out of trouble. After graduation, if he completed medical school, he'd receive the remainder as a lump sum. It's a smart plan, I told him. I want you to be the trustee. The words caught me off guard. Harold, I'm not qualified for that. I don't know anything about managing money or... You know Marcus. You know what I want for him, and you don't have any financial stake in the outcome. Harold leaned back in his chair. My children would be too emotionally invested. They'd either be too lenient or too controlling. I need someone who can be objective. It was the first time Harold had asked me to take on real responsibility, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. But looking at him, seeing the hope in his eyes, the trust he was placing in me, I couldn't say no. Okay, I said. But I want to meet him first. Get to know him before I agree to anything. Harold's face lit up. I was hoping you'd say that. Sarah's bringing the family out for Easter. It'll be the perfect opportunity. Easter was still 2 weeks away, but Harold started planning immediately. He wanted everything to be perfect. The house cleaned, the guest rooms prepared, special meals planned. He was excited in a way I hadn't seen before, like a kid planning his birthday party. It made what happened next even more devastating. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Harold was at his doctor's appointment. Sarah's voice was tight with stress. Is Uncle Harold there? I need to talk to him about Easter. He's at the doctor. Can I take a message? There was a pause. Who is this? Danny, Harold's brother. I'm staying in the guest house. Another pause, longer this time. I didn't know Harold had a brother staying with him. It's a recent arrangement. Is everything okay? Actually, no. We're not going to be able to make it for Easter. Marcus broke his leg in soccer practice, and he's looking at surgery. The timing is just terrible. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. Sarah was a doctor herself. But when it comes to your own kid, medical knowledge doesn't make the worry go away. I'm sure Harold will understand, I said. Will you tell him? I feel awful about canceling, but I can't leave Los Angeles right now. After I hung up, I sat in Harold's kitchen trying to figure out how to break the news. He'd been so excited about seeing Marcus, about implementing his plan for the education fund. The disappointment was going to hit him hard. When Harold got home, he took the news better than I'd expected. These things happen, he said, but I could see the sadness in his eyes. The important thing is that Marcus gets the help he needs. They'll reschedule once he's better. Of course they will. Harold poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table. In the meantime, I've been thinking about some changes to my estate planning. What kind of changes? I want to revise my will, add some provisions for you. I nearly choked on my coffee. Harold, that's not necessary. You're already doing more than enough. Hear me out. Harold held up a hand. You've been here for almost a year now. You've become more than just someone who helps around the house. You've become family. The word hit me like a physical blow. Family. It was something I'd never really had, not in any meaningful sense. Our parents had died when we were both adults, and Harold and I had been virtual strangers for most of our lives. I want to make sure you're taken care of, Harold continued. The guest house, for starters. I want you to have it outright. along with enough money to maintain it and pay the taxes. Harold, I'm not finished. I also want you to have a role in managing the Marcus Trust Fund, just like we discussed. But I'm thinking bigger now. What if instead of just education, we set up something that could help him with a house down payment? Starting his practice, major life expenses. It was a generous plan, but I was still stuck on the first part. You want to leave me the guest house? It's your home now, isn't it? I looked around the kitchen where we'd shared so many meals, so many conversations. It had become home in a way I hadn't expected. But the idea of Harold leaving it to me felt wrong somehow, like I was taking advantage of an old man's loneliness. Your kids won't understand, I said. They'll have to. It's my money. My decision. Harold's voice had the firm tone he'd probably used in courtrooms. Besides, the house and the trust fund are just a small part of my estate. Sarah and Thomas will still inherit the bulk of everything. Over the next few weeks, Harold worked with his attorney to revise his will. I tried to stay out of the process, but he insisted on keeping me informed. He wanted to make sure I understood my responsibilities as trustee, and he wanted my input on the specific terms of Marcus's trust. The key is balance, he explained. Generous enough to make a real difference in his life, but structured enough that he can't just blow it all. We settled on a plan that would give Marcus access to funds for education, professional development, and major life milestones, with the remainder coming to him at age 35. It was a substantial amount, enough to change the trajectory of a young man's life. The new will was signed and notarized on a Thursday in May. Harold seemed relieved to have it done, like he'd checked an important item off his to-do list. 2 weeks later, Marcus called to say he was coming to visit. Marcus arrived on a Friday afternoon in late May, driving a beat-up Honda Civic with Oregon plates. He was taller than I'd expected from the photos, probably 6'2", with the kind of effortless confidence that comes from being 17 and thinking you know everything. "So you're the famous Uncle Danny," he said when Harold introduced us. "Grandpa talks about you all the time. Mostly good things, I hope." Marcus grinned. He says you're the one who got him organized. Mom will be relieved. She's been worried about him living alone. Harold had invited Marcus to stay for 2 weeks, ostensibly to help with some yard work, but really just to spend time together. The kid was good company, funny, curious, and surprisingly mature for his age. He asked thoughtful questions about Harold's law practice, about my construction background, about what it was like living in Oregon. "I'm thinking about going to school here," he said one evening. We were sitting on Harold's back porch, watching the sunset. U of O has a good pre-med program, and it's a lot cheaper than Stanford. Harold's face lit up. "That would be wonderful. You could visit more often." "That's the idea. I feel bad that we don't see you more, Grandpa. Family should stick together." It was an innocent comment, but it hit me hard. Marcus had what I'd never had, a sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than himself. Even Harold, despite his loneliness, had that connection to his children and grandchildren. Over the 2 weeks, I watched Harold bloom in Marcus's presence. They'd spend hours talking about everything from baseball to philosophy. Harold would tell stories about his law practice, and Marcus would hang on every word. It was clear they had a special bond. He reminds me of myself at that age. Harold told me one evening after Marcus had gone to bed. Ambitious, idealistic, convinced he can change the world. He probably can. Maybe, but he'll need help. Good guidance, financial support, people who believe in him. Harold looked at me. "I'm glad you'll be there for him." The weight of that responsibility was starting to sink in. Harold was trusting me with his grandson's future, with a substantial amount of money, with decisions that could affect multiple generations. It was both an honor and a burden. Marcus left on a Sunday morning, promising to visit again before starting his senior year. Harold seemed smaller after he was gone, like part of his energy had left with his grandson. "I made the right choice," he said as we watched the Honda disappear down the street. "The trust fund, the will, all of it. Marcus is going to do great things." I hoped he was right. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all making plans based on a future that might not unfold the way we expected. 3 months later, Marcus was dead. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in August. I knew it was bad news before I answered. Nobody calls at that hour with good news. Harold. Sarah's voice was broken, barely recognizable. Is Harold there? Harold had been sleeping, but the phone had woken him too. He appeared in the hallway in his bathrobe, already knowing something was wrong. It's Sarah, I said, handing him the phone. I went to the kitchen to give him privacy, but I could hear enough to piece together what had happened. A car accident. Late night. Marcus had been driving home from a friend's house when he hit a patch of black ice and lost control. The car had rolled 3 times before hitting a tree. Harold aged 10 years during that phone call. When he finally hung up, he sat down heavily in his chair and stared at the wall. He's gone, he said simply. I wanted to say something comforting, something that would help, but there are no words for that kind of loss. Instead, I sat with him in silence until morning. The funeral was held in Los Angeles, and Harold insisted on going despite his doctor's concerns about his health. I drove him there, partly because I was worried about him traveling alone, and partly because I'd grown fond of Marcus during his visit. It was my first time meeting Sarah and Thomas in person. They were gracious enough, thanking me for taking care of their father, but I could tell they were puzzled by my presence. Who was this brother they'd barely heard of, and why was he suddenly so involved in their father's life? Harold delivered the eulogy, speaking about Marcus's potential, his kindness, his bright future that had been cut short. It was a beautiful tribute, but watching Harold struggle through it, seeing him fumble for words he'd always been able to find, I realized how much the dementia had progressed. The flight home was quiet. Harold stared out the window most of the time, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, somewhere over Nevada, he spoke. I need to change the will. Again. Harold, the trust fund for Marcus, all those provisions, they don't make sense anymore. His voice was flat, matter of fact. I need to figure out what to do with that money. Over the next few weeks, Harold struggled with the decision. The money that had been earmarked for Marcus's future was substantial, nearly $2 million. He could redistribute it to his other grandchildren, donate it to charity, or add it to Sarah and Thomas's inheritance. What do you think I should do? He asked me one evening. It's not my decision to make, Harold, but you knew him. You understood what I wanted for him. Harold's eyes were pleading. Help me figure out how to honor that. We eventually decided to establish a scholarship fund at the University of Oregon, focused on pre-med students from modest backgrounds. It felt like something Marcus would have approved of, helping other kids achieve the dreams he'd never get to pursue. But Harold also made another decision, one that would have far more impact on all our lives. He increased my inheritance substantially. I want you to have the main house too, Harold said. We were in his study going over the revised will with his attorney. Harold, that's too much. Your children. My children have their own homes, their own lives. They don't need this place. Harold's voice was firm, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The dementia was getting worse, making him more impulsive, less able to think through consequences. His attorney, an elderly man named Robert Kim, looked uncomfortable. Harold, perhaps we should discuss this with Sarah and Thomas before making such a significant change. It's my house, Robert. I can leave it to whoever I want. Of course, but Danny has been more of a son to me these past 2 years than either of my children have been in the past decade. Harold's words were harsh, unfair to Sarah and Thomas, but I could see the grief and frustration driving them. In the end, Harold got his way. The new will left the entire property to me, along with half of his investment portfolio and the remainder of what had been Marcus's trust fund. Sarah and Thomas would still inherit substantial amounts, but not as much as they'd been expecting. Are you sure about this? I asked Harold after Mr. Kim left. You're the only one who's been here for me, he said. When I needed help, when I was scared, when I was grieving, you were here. Family is supposed to be about more than just blood. I wanted to argue with him, to point out that his children lived across the country and had their own families to worry about. But Harold was determined. and increasingly, his determination was all he had left. The dementia progressed quickly after Marcus's death. Harold would have good days and bad days, but the bad days became more frequent. He'd forget conversations we'd had, repeat the same stories, sometimes not recognize me at all. I became his caregiver as much as his companion, helping him with medications, making sure he ate, watching for signs that he was becoming a danger to himself. Sarah and Thomas started calling more often, and I could hear the worry in their voices. They wanted to hire professional caregivers, maybe look into assisted living facilities, but Harold was adamant about staying in his own home. "Promise me," he said during one of his lucid moments. "Promise you won't let them put me in some facility." I promise. It was a promise that would become increasingly difficult to keep. Harold's condition deteriorated steadily over the next year. He had a series of small strokes that left him weaker and more confused. The doctor said it was vascular dementia, accelerated by grief and stress. I did my best to care for him, but I wasn't trained for it. I hired a part-time nurse to help during the days, and I took the night shifts. Harold's children visited more frequently, and they were grateful for the care I was providing, but I could see the questions in their eyes. The end came suddenly. Harold had a massive stroke on a Wednesday morning while I was helping him get dressed. He died at the hospital 2 days later, with all of us around his bed. At the funeral, Thomas gave a moving eulogy about their father's dedication to justice, his love for his family, his generous spirit. Sarah spoke about his pride in his grandchildren, his excitement about their achievements. They were both gracious enough to thank me for caring for him during his final years. I thought that would be the end of it. Harold was gone, and I'd have to figure out what came next. I was expecting to return to Portland, maybe find a small apartment, look for work I could do with my physical limitations. I wasn't expecting the reading of the will to turn into a courtroom battle. The lawyer's office felt like a tribunal. Sarah and Thomas sat on one side of the conference table with their attorney, while I sat on the other side with Patricia Chen, the estate lawyer I'd hastily hired when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple matter. Rebecca sat next to Sarah, her face a mask of controlled anger. She'd married Thomas 6 months before Harold's death, and while she'd only known him briefly, she'd clearly formed strong opinions about his final wishes. Mr. Kim read through the will methodically, his voice steady and professional. The usual legal language, the specific bequests, the charitable donations. Then he got to the major inheritances. To my son, Thomas, I leave the sum of $1 million and my collection of law books, with the hope that he'll understand the principles that guided my career. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. It was a substantial amount, if not what he'd been expecting. To my daughter Sarah, I leave the sum of $1 million and my wife's jewelry, with my love and gratitude for the grandchildren who brought such joy to my life. Sarah's eyes were wet, but she managed a small smile. To my brother Daniel, who showed me what family really means, I leave my house and property, my remaining investment portfolio, and the residue of my estate. The room went very quiet. Rebecca was the first to speak. What does that mean exactly? The residue? Mr. Kim cleared his throat. After the specific bequests and charitable donations, Mr. Brennan's estate is valued at approximately $4.8 million. The residue would be roughly $2.6 million, plus the property. Rebecca's carefully controlled expression cracked. That's impossible. Harold barely knew him. He wasn't even part of this family until a few years ago. The will is legally valid, Mr. Kim said carefully. Mr. Brennan was of sound mind when he signed it, and it was properly witnessed. Sound mind? Rebecca's voice rose. He had dementia. Everyone knew it. He was being manipulated by someone who took advantage of a sick old man. That's when the real battle began. Rebecca convinced Thomas that the will was the result of undue influence, that I'd isolated Harold from his family and manipulated him into changing his inheritance. She hired a lawyer who specialized in estate contests, and they filed suit to have the will overturned. The case dragged on for months. They brought in medical experts to testify about Harold's mental capacity. They questioned the timing of the will changes. They painted me as an opportunistic stranger who'd wormed his way into Harold's life for financial gain. I had to relive every conversation, every decision, every moment of the past 3 years. They made it sound sordid and calculated, like I'd been playing a long game from the moment I arrived. But the evidence was on my side. Harold's medical records showed that while he had dementia, he'd been competent when he signed the final will. His attorney testified that Harold had been clear about his wishes and his reasons for them. The nurse who'd helped care for Harold testified about our relationship, about how devoted I'd been to his care. Most importantly, we had Harold's own words. He'd written several letters explaining his decision, including one specifically addressed to his children. "Danny was here when I needed him," the letter read. "He gave up his own life to take care of me, to be my companion in my final years. He asked for nothing and gave everything. If that's not family, I don't know what is." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Rebecca and her lawyer did their best to discredit me, to make me look like a con artist and Harold look like a victim. But in the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The will stood as written. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt hollow. I'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. Harold's family was broken, probably permanently. His children would never forgive me for what they saw as theft of their inheritance. And I was left with more money than I'd ever imagined having, but no one to share it with. Rebecca's words echoed in my head. "You weren't even part of the family." Maybe she was right. Maybe I'd been kidding myself about belonging somewhere, about finally having a home. But as I drove back to Harold's house, my house now, I thought about what Harold had written in his letter. Family isn't just about blood. It's about being there when someone needs you. It's about caring enough to stay, even when it's hard. It's about love that's chosen, not just inherited. Harold chose to make me his family, and I chose to make him mine. That's worth more than any amount of money, even if I'm the only one who believes it. The guest house sits empty now, but I kept it exactly as it was when I lived there. Sometimes I sit in Harold's study, surrounded by his law books and family photos, trying to figure out what he'd want me to do with this inheritance. I think he'd want me to remember that family is what you make it, not what you're born into. And maybe someday, I'll figure out how to make a family of my own.